Welcome to the Leo Canaan podcast. We're going to discuss the 4th of July and the implications of not celebrating that holiday for African Americans and what the title African American or the label African American means. Is it better to just consider yourself an American or an African American or Afro American? Because we've been through so many labels. Which one is spiritually empowering? And is the title of African American spiritually empowering? And is the celebration of the nation's birthday, the 4th of July, spiritually empowering? Remember to like, subscribe, and share. So there's a sentiment throughout Black culture about the 4th of July celebration and Independence Day. Frederick Douglass gave a speech in, I think it was 1852. And a quote from the speech was, "What is Independence Day to a slave?" I think that's, I don't know if that's verbatim, but that's pretty much, that's a quote, that's the gist of it. What is Independence Day to a slave? And so here, even today, and this was 12 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, which would not be signed until 1864. And he gave that speech in 1852, I believe.
He gave the speech in 1852, and then the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect 1863.
1863. So some 11 years later. So here in 2024, and the majority of African American culture feels a disconnect from the 4th of July, the Independence Day that was established 1776. And so they had been celebrating that some 100 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, which would not happen until 1863. And then the Civil War was 1864, correct?
The Civil War was 1861 to 1864, 1865.
And so Frederick Douglass was an abolitionist. He had been born a slave, an extremely intelligent man for any day and age, but one of the most intelligent people alive. And he had been touring the country for some time at this point. And this was the speech that he gave and for that Independence Day. I think there's a lot of things that Black culture in America do not take into consideration. And first, I would say, if Frederick Douglass was alive today, would he celebrate Independence Day? Because this speech was made 11 years before the freeing of the slaves. And the funny thing is, we get into so many different odd discussions about these different labels. African Americans have gone through, Afro-American, Black, African American, and some people, and people that I admire, prefer to be just called American as opposed to African American. I personally prefer African American. And the reason why is there's a lot of spiritual laws at play that most African Americans don't take into consideration. One of which is the title of African American always honors those ancestors that died in that Middle Passage and that died during the time of slavery. I would never want to drop the African American. Because here today, we are absolutely Americans.
Yeah.
But those men and women and those children that were taken from those African shores, and some of them died on that transatlantic route, and many of them died on those plantations. They only knew themselves as Africans.
Yeah.
They would never know themselves as African Americans. And so personally, I feel that African American always honors those ancestors. Why would you want to drop that?
Especially if you don't know like exactly what country in Africa. And they were purposely severed from it when they got here, but at least keeping that, like prefix,
Exactly.
It keeps that alive.
They came from all over the continent of Africa, and they were ushered to that West Coast. And they left that West Coast on those slave ships, and they left that continent of Africa. And that African American title, it honors them and it honors us, because in a lot of ways that struggle, those challenges continue in different ways.
Do you think Frederick Douglass, because he was an abolitionist and he was like the article I read about the speech he gave, he very much admires the founding fathers as great men, very intelligent, like enlightened men, but also hypocritical because of, their thoughts on freedom and who it applied to. Do you think today he would feel the same about Independence Day, given like the Jim Crow laws that have been in place and the systemic racism that's been still in place?
Based on the fact that Frederick Douglass did live in a day where just separated 100 years or so from the time of the founding fathers, he did admire them, with the caveat that he saw them as being hypocritical. Now, there are spiritual laws and processes that have to take place in founding a country and building a country. Because when you build a country, when you start a country, and this country was founded on African spirituality, and that is shown by the fact that our most preeminent founding father, which is George Washington, he is the singular founding father.
Yeah.
His monument is an Egyptian obelisk. And it is the tallest Egyptian obelisk in the world, standing at 555 feet. And so this country was founded on African spirituality. That's another reason why that title should not be dropped. And because he spoke about the founding fathers the way he did, I certainly believe if Frederick Douglass was alive today, he would celebrate Independence Day. He made his speech when slaves were still in chains. And so that's another, these labels, that people, everything is labeled now. And I think, and as much as I love my people, in some ways, in some of these most important issues and concerns, they continue to be misguided, because African Americans have more reason to celebrate the 4th of July more than anybody, because independence means more to African Americans than anybody. They know what true independence is about.
Yeah.
And I think that can only be compared to the founding fathers and the ancestors of the white Americans that were here, that fought in that Revolutionary War. So that Independence Day, the 4th of July should mean the most to the direct descendants of slaves into the direct descendants of the Americans or the white Americans
that were here fighting
that war. Mm-hmm. Now, because since that time, since 1776, you have had, quite a bit of immigrants come in through Ellis Island, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And they celebrate, they've been here for generations, and they celebrate Independence Day.
Because it's supposed to be the land of opportunity.
So it takes on a different meaning to everybody. Mm-hmm. But, and that's not to say you shouldn't celebrate Juneteenth, mm-hmm. which is the corresponding day that the slaves were free, but the last slaves did not find out that they were actually free until I think it was June 19th. Mm-hmm. And so this is a side Independence Day. But the problem I have with it is when you talk about spiritual laws, Juneteenth is out of sync with the country's birthday. And according to this country has a birthday. Imagine this. Let's use an analogy. Mm-hmm. Let's say you're a king or a queen of a land. Mm-hmm. And you have your birthday is celebrated every year, whatever that day may be. Your birthday is celebrated. And everybody celebrates your birthday. But you have this group of people that live in this certain region of your land. They refuse to celebrate your birthday. Mm-hmm. And they don't want to participate in the celebration at all. Mm-hmm. Okay? And then when it comes time for them to come to the king's court or the queen's court for favor or for judgment or something, and you look and you see this group of people that live in this particular jurisdiction that refuse to celebrate you on your birthday. Mm-hmm. How do you feel about them?
As a king?
As a king.
I would say it's treasonous.
We say it's treasonous, right?
As a king, yeah.
Yeah. Now, in this country, in any country that is founded on certain spiritual principles, that country is given a birth date because the country itself is a living being. Mm-hmm. This country has a soul. This country also has a spirit. Mm-hmm. And this country also has a physical body. Mm-hmm. And this country also has a birth date. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
That's why Washington, D.C. rests pretty much in the northeast corner of the nation. Mm-hmm. There are spiritual principles and there's spiritual concepts that must be enacted and spiritual rituals that must be enacted. And an apotheosis must take place so that the country has an active spirit in the spirit world.
What's an apotheosis?
Apotheosis is where we'll speak about George Washington in particular, the preeminent founding father of this nation, has had an apotheosis where he was deified, where he was made a god. Mm-hmm. Exactly the same as Augustus did for Julius Caesar, the same as many, many pharaohs, several Caesars, some kings. And it's just something that we don't talk about a lot nowadays because there's not a broad understanding of what it means.
Would you say Abraham Lincoln also had one, or not quite?
Abraham Lincoln has, I don't know that he had a textbook apotheosis, mm-hmm. but he is deified. He is deified. And so his spirit does exist in a spirit realm to help govern and protect this nation. You know, and so just, you know, based on how most people live their lives in a state of cognitive dissonance, they don't understand that the spirit world is much more powerful than the physical world. And so by disconnecting yourself from the celebration of this country's birthday, you are hindering your ultimate success and certain things that you want back from your country. You know, and so African Americans are, by doing that, you're basically isolating yourself.
Yeah.
From the protection of the spirit of the country.
Would you say, this is probably going to sound bad, but it's kind of like, you know, when you have with teenagers, they have this mindset where like they want to be included in everything, but then they isolate themselves, and then it's like they can't quite find the spot where they're participating where they want to, but then have their individuality. Is that?
Yeah, I don't say that. I don't think that it sounds bad, because culturally, Black culture is, for the most part, not as mature as it should be. It did not get the opportunity to start maturing. You know,
It was so.
Well, I mean, think about it. For those hundreds of years, African Americans existed as slaves. And I take issue with the title slaves, with that label. You know, I don't think it's accurate.
What would you use as a term?
Prisoners of war.
Yeah.
Yeah. It wasn't, slavery has always existed. And it didn't exist the way it did in America until we had chattel slavery. And so as opposed to calling it what it really is which is more akin to prisoners of war, then we give it a new name, chattel slavery. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But the whole process of calling it slaves is a disempowering title. And it constantly drains a spiritual power from this people that believed themselves, their ancestors, to be slaves. I don't think Black people were ever slaves in this country. They were prisoners of war. And this was evident by the warring African nations that would then sell their prisoners of war to the slave traders. You see what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense.
You know, slavery historically has existed in every time and age throughout humanity. And it was on the spectrum of indentured servitude.
Yeah.
It was, you would say that spectrum exists where you have at one end of that spectrum indentured servitude, and at the other end of that spectrum you would have slavery. Even in ancient Rome, during the Bacchus rituals, the slaves and the patricians would switch roles for a day.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
So the slaves would become the patricians, and the patricians would become the slaves, and this would play out for a day. Now, can you imagine something like that happening in the antebellum South?
Oh God, no.
No, because it wasn't slavery in the antebellum South. It was a much more perverse thing going on. It's harmful to African Americans. Two things are extremely harmful to them spiritually. And one is to not celebrate the nation's birthday. They should be celebrating July 4th with more enthusiasm than anybody. and celebrate Juneteenth if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. Celebrate the independence from Juneteenth all the way to July 4th.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter. But in July 4th can be the grand finale.
Yeah.
But July 4th has to be celebrated by African Americans because it disconnects them from the spiritual power of the country. And not only does it weaken them, it weakens the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I say them, I mean, I am African American, but I celebrate the 4th of July. But as a culture, we need to celebrate the 4th of July because it weakens, Black people are the soul of this country.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that wants to, you want to talk about that or not, Black people are the soul of this country.
Yeah. Do you think that the disenfranchisement, like the not wanting to celebrate the 4th, is perpetuated more through the Black community itself, or is it kind of put into the Black community from outside sources?
I think I'm glad you addressed it that way because, I have some thoughts about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of things occur that way, especially since the birth of social media.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before social media, there was a little bit of disgruntled talk about the 4th of July, but it didn't become a thing until social media. Mm-hmm. And since social media, we've had, Juneteenth as a federal holiday.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a good thing. Juneteenth, the official day that the last slaves became aware that they were free. That that should be honored.
Yeah,
but as we know, this government has never done African Americans any favors. Civil rights movement was not a favor. Mm-hmm. They've never done any favors for the Black community. Now, and putting that in the context of the 4th of July, by officiating Juneteenth, what it kind of does is make it official that the 4th of July is not your holiday. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it kind of makes it official without saying it. Okay, we'll give you a holiday. Mm-hmm. But the unspoken word is that this is not your holiday. Mm-hmm. It's a form of segregation. Mm-hmm. The same as having a Black History Month.
Right.
It's a form of segregation. Mm-hmm. And it's just very subtle. And like I always say, the most powerful word in the English language is subtle. Mm-hmm. Literally the word subtle. That is the most powerful word in the language because it's the subtle things that are the most powerful. And so by disconnecting Black culture from the celebration of the 4th of July, it weakens the nation. It weakens African American culture, but it also weakens the nation because African American culture is the soul of this nation.
Mm-hmm. I have another question. It kind of goes back to the founding of the country, where I've heard a lot, like going through history. I enjoy history, where the question of slavery was a huge issue with creating the country, like the Constitution, how we're forming, like, do we allow it? Do we not? And this is, 1700s. And my understanding from what I've read is that at the time of forming the Constitution, it was more important to get the country up and running on a sound government structure, because a different the initial government set up right after the revolution failed, and so that's when we got the Constitution, the 3 branches of the government and everything, and they decided that slavery needed to be an issue decided later, How do you feel about that not being addressed immediately within, the forming of this country?
There's multiple reasons why it couldn't be addressed at that time. If they tried to address it at that time, the nation would have not been founded when it should have. And whether people realize it or not, dates are important. The date of this country's birthday had to be July 4th, 1776, for multiple reasons. There's a certain energy for that year. There's a certain energy for that date. There's a certain energy for that moment. And that was the birth date that this country had to have. Now, if you look closely at your history, that date was chosen. And there's reasons why that date was chosen, because there's a lot of metaphysical and esoteric principles at play here to make a living, breathing nation that can last. We're gonna get, we're America's experiencing rocky times right now. George Washington never wanted a two-party political system.
Yeah.
But even more so, he didn't want to be a monarch. And so what else is there? Right. But I mean, we'll get 2,000 years out of this country.
Yeah.
Or, if not more.
Well, even Rome went through some civil unrest and governmental changes in its history as a republic.
Yeah, and we'll experience a rebirth, but the to your point, slavery couldn't be addressed at that time. It was unfortunate, but imagine when you look closely at nature, when you plant a seed in the ground and you want that seed to grow and you water that seed, and whatever it is, it's an acorn tree or an oak tree or whatever. It's a tiny seed, but in order for that tree to begin, that seed has to be destroyed. And slavery, along with many other things, were a part of that seed. And African Americans are definitely coming into our own. It's a natural force that accompanies African people. And, Africa as a whole is the planet's resource. It is the planet's resource. And unfortunately, that includes the people. But everything in Africa is a resource. And, you have people that know this and you have people that don't know that. And usually the people that know this are kings. Yeah. That the entire continent of Africa is a resource. And this is why it's Mother Africa. And like I said, the unfortunate part about that is that it includes the people as a resource.
Which is what happened.
Which is what happened. At that point in time, the people were used as a resource, and this goes back even when Africa itself, thousands of years ago, was ruled by kings. Slavery, being a little black boy growing up in this country, you talk about African American history always starts with slavery.
Yeah.
And then slavery is not the beginning of African American history. Slavery is the interruption of it. Slavery simply interrupted. The second thing I think African Americans need to pay attention to, firstly, is the fact that as a culture, we need to celebrate the nation's birthday. Regardless of what your personal sentiments are about it, because it disconnects the culture from the spiritual power of the nation. And since African Americans are the soul of this nation, it weakens the nation itself. And secondly, it is important to maintain that title, African American, just like you have Irish American, Italian American, Japanese American, Korean American, German American. That African American probably has more gravitas than all of them. Mm-hmm. And it is a reminder to honor those African ancestors that were taken from that land, and they would never return, and they would never know America the way we know it. Mm-hmm. All they would know is they were taken from their homeland, and we know that homeland is Africa. And so African Americans should wear that with honor and celebrate the 4th of July with honor. By not celebrating the 4th of July, in effect, what you're saying is you're still a slave. Now, whether you realize you're saying that or not, because words are power and intentions are power. So whether you realize what you're saying, what you're communicating spiritually, regardless of what you think that may be, what you're communicating is that you are still a slave. And this is why you refuse to celebrate the nation's birthday. You should celebrate Independence Day for those slaves that could not celebrate it, that lived and died and were born and lived and died under the chains of slavery. That title of African American should be worn with honor, and that holiday should be celebrated with honor.